You know what's going to happen every year with the NBA offseason? These front offices, these general managers just can't help themselves. Now, to be fair to them, in this salary cap environment, you do have a salary floor. You have to spend at least a certain amount of money. So sometimes, out of necessity, guys get overpaid. But the problem is now is that everybody gets overpaid. And this madness has to stop because at some point in time, the NBA is going to have a real problem on their hands. Let's take a look at the upcoming season, 2017-2018 season. The salary cap is right around $99 million. $99 million. Sounds like, in theory, a lot of money to distribute amongst a roster of about 15 players. It is. You're saying that you're going to average $6.5 million per salary if or so, a little bit more to stay right around that number. You would think you could field a professional team like that. In theory, you would think. But you can't do that in today's NBA. Especially when you look at some of the God-blessed contracts that are being given out. These teams just can't help themselves spending like drunken sailors with a massive hard-on for love you long time, make you come like crazy, $5 extra. In this case, $5 extra is about an extra $50 million over 4 to 5 years. You know you're in a bad place when your salary cap is $99 million, but Blake Griffin is going to average $35 million a year. So over a third of your salary cap space for a dumb organization like the Clippers, because of course the Clippers going to clip, is going to Blake Griffin. But he's not alone. Denver just gave Paul Millsap $90 million over 3 years. You just gave Paul Millsap, an undersized 4, entering into close to his mid-30s, $30 million a year. $30 million. So again, talking about tying 30% of your salary cap in a borderline Eastern Conference All-Star who's going to be just kind of another face in the crowd in the Western Conference. Then you look at the next tier below that. Serge Ibaka just got $22 million a year from the Toronto Raptors. Otto Porter signed an offer sheet for $21.5 million a year. Otto fucking Porter, he who finally broke out a little bit in this past season to average about 13.5 points a game. The NBA has gotten so stupid now that 13.5 points a game is apparently worth $20+ million a season. Even the borderline NBA players, the scrubs, the role players are getting massive money. Joe Ingles just got $52 million over 4 years from the Utah Jazz. Tony Snell got 46 over 4. That's $11.5 million a year for the Bucks. When he averaged like 7 or 8 points a game, and that was considered a breakout season for him. When you're giving out money like this, and your salary cap is such where it's hovering around $100 million, at some point in time, you're going to have almost no team that's going to be able to stay under the salary cap. Most of your teams eventually are going to get into the luxury tax. So you're going to get into a situation where teams can't dump salary because there's nobody to dump salary to. Big name players aren't going to be able to change teams, so they're going to lose leverage, and maybe that's the whole point. I don't know. But I think back to the late 90s Bulls. And let's look at the team that won 72 games in that 95-96 season. And let's say after that season, the top 4 guys, I'm talking about Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, and Kukoc, were all free agents. And their contracts were up. And you're going to pay them all because you got to keep them all. And you have bird rights to these guys, so you're going to be able to go over the cap in order to keep them. Well, based off of current contract values, if you took that team and put it now, you're going to pay Jordan at least $40 million a year. You're going to pay Pippen about $35 million a year. You're going to pay Dennis Rodman $25 million a year. You say $25 million a year for Rodman. If Dwight Howard gets over $20 million a year and fucking Tristan Thompson's dumbass gets $16 million a year, fuck you, Rodman's going to get $25 million a year. And Kukoc is going to get $20 million a year. That's 4 players. One of the original super teams in my mind anyways, that actually worked. $40 million for Jordan, $35 for Pippen, $25 million more for Rodman, another $20 million for Kukoc. You're talking about a team with just 4 players has a total salary of $120 million. That still needs to fill out another 11 roster spots. You still got to pay money for Kerr and Harper and Longley and Bushler and Randy Brown and Bill Wennington, and so forth. Leaving you no flexibility to go out and get anybody, leaving you very little flexibility in terms of how much you could pay the guys that you actually do bring in. And even if some guys want to go and play with Jordan and Pippen and such, only certain guys are going to. You're going to get to a point very soon where almost every NBA team is in this position. And we're talking about like Washington Wizards type of stuff where John Wall's going to get $40 million a year. Bradley Beal down the road might get $30 million a year. Otto Porter's getting 20-something million a year. Somebody else on that team eventually will get 20-something million a year. So you're talking about 110 to 120 million on 4 players and maybe making it to the second round of the Eastern or Western Conference playoffs. This is absolute insanity. And these NBA teams are creating this environment where everybody's getting paid, and right now teams apparently don't seem to mind that much because they're paying it. The players union doesn't seem to mind because even if the scrubs are getting paid, all that does is eventually drag up the market value for other guys, so that means even more guys are getting paid in the 20s, which means eventually more guys are going to get paid in the 30s, which means eventually more guys are going to get paid in the 40s of millions of dollars a year. But it's just not sustainable long term. I look at the Minnesota Timberwolves, who right now in theory seem to be positioned relatively well. You're talking about a team heading into 2017, 2018, that with the salaries that they have on the books, with the additions of Jeff Teague, with the addition of Taj Gibson, they're at about $111 million. So they're over the cap by over $10 million, but they're still under the luxury tax threshold. But you're talking about a team that has Wiggins and Towns still on their rookie deals. Frankly, Teague's under $20 million. Taj Gibson's at $14 million, which in this market, he almost got paid as much as Joe Ingles. Joe Ingles only got a little bit less. I would much rather pay Taj Gibson what the Timberwolves paid, or as we call them now, the Timberwolves paid for Taj Gibson, as the Jazz just paid for Joe Ingles. But you still got Jimmy Butler on a deal where he's making less than $20 million a year, even with the 5% trade kicker for this upcoming season and the following season before he could potentially hit free agency again. So you look at it and you say, hey, the Timberwolves are in a good place for this year. But then you go to the next offseason. They're going to have $86 million tied up in just 7 players. You're going to have Karl Anthony Towns entering the last year of his rookie contract. Andrew Wiggins' rookie contract is going to be up, where you're probably looking at having to pay him potentially $25 million a year. So now you look at the Timberwolves, they're back at $111 million in terms of salary, and there are only 8 players under contract, and you need about 14 or 15 to fill out a roster in total. So you got 6 or 7 guys you still got to find, and you're already over the salary cap by quite a bit. You're eventually going to push into luxury tax territory. Then the following season, assuming you re-sign Andrew Wiggins, you've still got Jeff Teague there. For some reason, you gave Gorgie Deng $16 million a goddamn year. Now you've got both Jimmy Butler and Karl Anthony Towns entering into free agency, knowing you just, let's assume that they want to keep both of them. That means that you're going to pay Jimmy Butler probably about $35 million a year, Karl Anthony Towns about $30 million a year, which means you're already at $126 million for 5 players. You're already into the luxury tax just with your starting lineup. You don't even have a bench yet. How can anybody think this is good? How can anybody think this is sustainable long term? At some point in time, you're going to get to a situation where nobody's going to have cap space. So teams are going to be hamstrung in terms of wanting to approve and change their rosters and make transactions, make moves happen. Then you're also talking about players eventually are going to get to a point where their options are limited, where they're going to lose leverage. And while on the one hand you can applaud the NBA for getting these players these contracts with this type of guaranteed money at stake, eventually that well will potentially dry up because teams just aren't going to have the financial flexibility to be able to do anything to make any moves. That's where it's not just ridiculous that Tony Snell gets $11.5 million a year because he's getting double-digit millions a year to be a scrub. It's the fact of he is getting over 10% of the salary cap space of a team to be basically a scrub. Somebody like George Hill's getting $19 million a year to be an average NBA starter. He's getting 20% of your cap space as an average starter. How could this be sustainable for anybody? The only teams that you're going to have that are going to be able to stay under the salary cap are those teams that intentionally tank. And do we want to get to a point where we're rewarding the teams consistently that consistently tank just to stay under the salary cap, just to stay under the luxury tax threshold? At some point in time, it's going to be a problem for teams because they're not going to be able to make improvements. They're not going to be able to add new players. They're not going to be able to dump salary because, again, there's going to be nobody to fucking dump the salary to. You're not going to be able to do a lot of these things. And for players at some point in time, you're going to be stuck in your situation because if that team has your bird rights, then they could keep going more and more over the cap in order to keep you, but nobody else is going to pay you anything close to what you feel your market value should be, could be, or needs to be, or ought to be. This madness has to stop. The NBA's got to do something, and it's a variety of factors. They got to go two and done with the college kids because so often now for these teams that take these kids high in the draft, by the time they get to the end of their rookie contract, they're maybe 23 years of age. They're just finally starting to develop into players. But now look at Otto Porter in Washington, whether the Wizards sign or match the offer sheet from the Nets or not. Otto Porter is going to get $21.5 million a year for averaging 13 points per game last season. Sure, there is more upside there. There is a potential he could be a 20-point-per-game scorer long term. But again, you're paying so much off of potential and not what has actually happened. He could just have flatlined out to be a 13, 14, 15-point-per-game player, and you were paying him a fifth of your salary cap space. And the salary cap of the NBA is not due to go up that much over the next couple of years. Ding dong, dumb dicks, that's a major fucking problem. So, to keep kids in college longer to where they are more NBA ready when they do come in, so teams picking in the lottery have a chance to get bigger, better impact players right away, is a necessary thing. It must happen. We might have to sit there and consider lengthening the term of the rookie deal, putting an extra year on there. You kind of gotten to that point where you really have no choice because it's the only mechanism that teams are really going to have to be able to help give themselves any type of salary flexibility and any space under the salary cap at all. And at some point in time, we might have to get to a point where you will give teams a couple of different options. You give them the ability to use more amnesty type of deals where you can sit there and say, hey, Carmelo Anthony in New York, we just don't want you anymore. You'll still get paid, but we're going to waive you, and it's not going to count against our salary cap. You're going to have to give a team one of those every year because otherwise this shit, the math just doesn't add up. It's not going to work. We might have to look at potentially sitting there and saying, hey, if you're Cleveland, if you're LeBron James, and LeBron James, you stay there, the highest paid player's salary is not going to count against the team's salary cap because we're going to get to a point here. We've heard about John Wall thinking about an extension where he's going to make $42 million a year. So one player is going to get over 40% of your salary cap space when you still have 14 other players on your roster that you have to worry about paying. Does anybody else see the problem here? Does anybody else see that this is madness and the math just doesn't add up? Like when Mark Cuban was talking about a while back, the NFL's in a bad place, and even if we don't see it now, eventually their chickens are going to come home to roost because they're oversaturating the product. Mr. Cuban, respectfully, maybe let's focus a little less on the NFL and let's try to focus on the disaster that is coming with the NBA and the salary cap and the whole salary structure of the league. When you got scrubs getting paid superstar money, we're in a bad, bad place. And if for no other reason, then eventually that's going to really hamstring teams because they're going to be paying a ton of luxury tax, everybody across the board, to win 30 games. And then the players are going to lose leverage because there's going to be nobody else that has available cap space to be able to sign you. Nobody wins in this situation long term. Nobody. It's bad enough that these general managers can't fucking help themselves. It's another thing when we're creating a bubble that is due to burst. And at some point in time, I don't see how this bubble is going to do anything other than burst, and burst in a big bad way. Because ultimately, again, the math just doesn't add up.